In this video, we're going to digitally remove the seam between replacement mouth parts on a stop-motion puppet as part of our post-production workflow using the Adobe Creative Suite, specifically Photoshop, After Effects, and Premiere. For my animation, I used the Walt Lip Sync head from Animation Toolkit provided by the Aardman Academy for the Stop Motion 2 course. This isn't an ad, it's just in case you wanted to know what I used. As you can see, there's a seam between the mouth and the upper part of the face, as well as a seam between the face and the back of the head. But this workflow can be used on any stop-motion puppet with replacement seams. And bonus, the skills you learn could also be adapted to remove rigs. I shot my stop-motion animation with DragonFrame, so I have a folder of raw images, and when imported into Premiere or After Effects as an image sequence, they can be played back at a specified frame rate. Mine was shot at 24 frames per second, but I mostly shot doubles, effectively making it 12 frames per second. But I needed to play back at 24. If you created your animation with a different program and you only have a video file, that's okay. If you want to try this out, you could export an image sequence from your video so you have a folder of images to work with too. When I started this project, I thought I was going to edit frame by frame in Photoshop for all 953 frames. I really liked this method, I found it pretty relaxing, and I liked the results. But then I realized how long it was taking me, so I adapted and learned how After Effects can speed up the process. But you know what? I'm really glad I learned the Photoshop method first because it taught me a lot. So getting into it, the first step is prepping our files. Again, my animation was shot in DragonFrame. Once it was finished and I was happy with it, I conformed my timeline. Once conformed, I duplicated the X1 folder of images to be safe, and I'll work from that duplicated folder. I'm going to name it Seam Removal Image Sequence. I'm going to make two more folders, one called Seam Removed PSD, where I'll save the layered files in case I need to go back and edit them, and one called Seam Removed Image Sequence, where I will save my exported JPEGs. This will be my finished image sequence. Okay, let's get started. I've already done a bunch of these, so we're jumping into the middle of the process. My last frame is opened in Photoshop, and you'll notice a bunch of layers. The bottom layer is the background, which is the original shot in camera. Then we have two generative fill layers, and the top layer is the frame just before this one, copied on top. You'll see how this can come in handy. So this is frame 122. I'm going to open up the next frame, which is actually frame 124, because I shot on twos. Frame 123 is just a duplicate of frame 122. Then I'm going to copy frame 122 on top. I do this by going back to 122.psd, and then copying all the layers together with Control-Shift-C. Swing back to frame 124 and paste with Control-V. Now that I have both of these layers together, I can flip back and forth to see the differences between them by turning the top layer off and on. Okay, let's remove the seam. I'm going to grab my lasso tool, hotkey L on the keyboard, and I'm going to draw around the seam, leaving a bit of a margin, like in sewing, a little bit of a seam allowance. I'm using a Wacom tablet, which makes it a lot easier to draw, so if you have a mouse, you might find this method a little difficult. I found a small Wacom tablet for resale for about $100, and I highly recommend it. So if you don't have one, and you've been eyeing them for a while like I did, it's totally worth it. Okay, so now we've got our selection. Right-click and select Generative Fill. Do not type anything into the prompt, just click Generate. Generative Fill without a prompt will simply use the image you have provided and the pixels around the selection to create the fill. I've tried other fill methods, but content-aware fill and delete and fill selection don't really work well for this purpose. So now I look through the three generative options and I see which one fits best. There are slight differences between them, and you'll notice the biggest difference here is the shadow under the nose. It's really important to track this shadow from frame to frame to make sure that there's not a huge difference. The first time I ran through this, I was not looking at the shadow, and the shadow started flickering up and down throughout the animation, so I had to go back and fix it. But now I know, and you know, so keep an eye on that shadow. And your lighting might be totally different. This character is lit fairly flat. The key light is slightly off-center, and there's a little more shadow on the character's right side. But there's nothing fancy going on here. So you may have noticed I've only corrected one seam at this point. There's another seam here on the side. I intentionally am doing this in two parts to make it easier for the generative fill to do this correctly. I don't want to give it too much to do all at once because the results can vary. So let's do the second one. I'm going to use my lasso tool again, selecting around the seam with a bit of an allowance, I don't want to go too far out because I don't want it filling areas that it shouldn't. Now, here's a very important step. Before we generate a new fill, we have to select the layers we want it to base the selection on. Right now, I only have the first generative fill layer selected, so what I need to do is hold down Shift and select the background layer as well. Now, let's right-click on the selection and generate the next fill. I'm going to look through the 3 options that it gives me and pick the one I like best. If you don't like any of the options, if it does something weird, you can always generate 3 more without making a new selection. Just go over to the Properties panel and click Generate. It'll generate 3 more options. Then I'm going to check how this looks from the previous frame. I can use that previous frame layer, turning it on and off again, to see how things line up. And I'm definitely going to check that shadow under the nose. If I'm happy with this, great. If not, I can generate 3 more options on the first fill layer. But what if they're all crap? For some reason it's just not getting it. Well, I'm looking at these 2 frames and they're actually not that different. There's not a lot of movement going on here. Let's grab the shadow from the previous frame. I'm going to turn this layer on, make a selection around the nose. Let's feather it by 5 pixels. Copy, Control-C. And very important, paste in place with Control-Shift-V. Okay, let's turn off the previous frame layer and reposition the copied nose by selecting the Move tool, keyboard hotkey V, and using the arrow keys to move it 1 pixel in the direction I need. I'll turn the layer on and off until it's lined up. Then we can turn off the other layers and erase what we don't need. The Erase tool is keyboard hotkey E. I have the standard round brush with the hardness at 0. This will give it a really good blended edge. All I'm really looking to keep is that shadow. Then we can turn the other layers back on and see how it looks. I'm going to put that previous frame layer back on top and see how it looks frame to frame. Alright, I like that. Let's save this file. Control S. I'm going to save the layered PSD file in its own folder. And now I'm going to save a flat version of the file for my new image sequence with Save As. Control-Shift-S. And I'm going to save this in the Seam Removed Image Sequence folder. Once that's done, we can go back to the original image and check to see how many times this frame needs to be duplicated. I mostly shot on 2s, so I'd have to duplicate this 1 time. But I also shot a few 1s, so I don't have to duplicate anything. I shot a few 3s, I'd have to duplicate it twice, and there's probably an 8 or 10 in there somewhere too. So you gotta check. Okay, 124 and 125 are the same image, so I just need to duplicate it once. Switching over to my new image sequence folder, copy, paste, and rename, and we're done. On to the next one. As a quick note, we're about at the 8-minute mark in the video here, but when I get into the flow of working and build up muscle memory and speed, I can get this process done in about 2 to 4 minutes. It also depends on the frame. I'm also not going to sit here all day long for 8 hours a day doing this. I think that would be mental, but chipping away at it a little bit each day, I really like the results of this method. So I got 8 seconds, or about 200 frames into the seam removal process, frame by frame in Photoshop. It was just taking way too long. My animation is 40 seconds long, and while the results were great, I needed to make a deadline and get to the finish line faster. After Effects has a content-aware fill panel that can be used in a similar way and in tandem with Photoshop. So all the skills we just learned will be used in this method as well. Let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is import my image sequence. I'm going to check the settings, import as footage, create composition, import. Now there's 2 things I need to check. First, I need to interpret the footage. And we need to assume that the frame rate is not 30, but 24. I also want to check the composition settings as well. The resolution is the original camera image size, which I'm going to leave as is, because I'm going to crop for 16:9 at the very end. My frame rate needs to be 24, and the duration of my animation is going to be 40 seconds. Okay. Now, notice I only have 146 frames. You might find this as well if there is a break in the numbering of your image sequence. In my case, I had 2 takes, so I'm just going to quickly import the second part. Now we're ready for the first step. Let's bring our playhead to the first frame and focus in on the first 2 seconds. Then we're going to zoom in on the first seam using the zoom tool, keyboard hotkey Z. We're going to do these seams separately, so we're going to focus on one at a time, just like in Photoshop. We need to make sure we're selected on the correct layer. The selection tool in After Effects is keyboard hotkey V. And then we can start drawing a mask around the seam with the pen tool, keyboard hotkey G. Just roughly for now. And we're going to refine it later. Ah, where did everything go? Well, that's easy to find out. Hit the M key. That brings up our mask path. And we don't want the mask to be additive. We want it to be none. All right, we're back in business. Right now it's defaulted to this peach color, a bit too similar to what's behind it. Let's choose something with greater contrast by clicking on the colored square next to the mask settings. Maybe something in the teal family? Yeah, that's better. Now, I'm going to start refining my mask shape. So I want to see things a bit bigger. In any of the Adobe programs, you can double-click on any panel to view it full screen. Nice. Now we can zoom in further to get a better look at where my mask lines up. Alright, let's refine the mask using the selection tool, keyboard hotkey V. If you grab a point and the entire mask starts moving, just click an area outside the mask, and then click on a single point or handle to move it. So I'm refining each point to give it a similar seam allowance as I did when we worked in Photoshop. I want less of a seam allowance right under the nose because I don't want it creating a big shadow underneath. I don't want it recreating the nostril either, so maybe less of a seam allowance under there. That's better. And maybe a little bit more on this side. Alright, great. First one is done. To exit full screen again, just double-click the panel. This mask will need to be keyframed for the entire animation. And while you may be thinking, dude, how is this faster than going frame by frame in Photoshop? I assure you, keyframing masks was at least 3 times faster than the frame by frame method, and we'll be cutting out the time spent saving files for each frame. With that argument settled, let's forge on. I'm going to add a keyframe to this mask on my first frame by clicking the stopwatch on the mask path setting. Then we'll move down the timeline to where the image changes. At the beginning of my animation, I always place a hold, so this will be one of the few spots where you don't need a keyframe for every frame. I'm moving along the timeline while holding Control and using the arrow keys. Beware, if you use the arrow keys without Control, you'll be moving the position of the selected mask, mask point, or the position of your layer, whatever happens to be selected. Okay, once I find the first movement of my character, I'm going to go back 1 frame and add a keyframe. Why? So now my mask will not move from the first frame through the last frame of the animated hold. Since I mostly shot on 2s, most of my timeline is going to have a keyframe on each frame. Now I can move to the next frame, and with the mask selected, I can use the arrow keys to move the mask slightly to the right with my character. Not a lot of movement for this one. And then I can hold down the Control key and press the arrow keys to see how it moves with the character. The next frame is exactly the same, so I can copy and paste the keyframe. Control-C, Control-V. The next move is a bit bigger, so with my mask selected, I can use the arrow keys and move it to the left. Or for larger moves, you can hold down Shift and the arrow key and move it by 10 pixels. And so quickly, I'm going to zoom back in and refine the mask for this frame. Going back to the timeline, I can select the playhead and look at the next few frames. I have a hold on 1 frame, so we can copy and paste the keyframe from the previous one. Now, we can speed this whole process up a bit by moving down the timeline about a half a second, or until there's a big move or a change. Then we'll copy and paste the keyframe all the way down here. So with the keyframe selected, I can grab the mask with the selection tool and drag it close to where it needs to go. Then I'll zoom in here and refine the mask again. Skipping down the timeline serves 2 purposes. First, the points between the keyframes will automatically smooth, bringing them closer to where they're going to end up. So this speeds things up down the line. Second, it reduces boredom. This frame is giving us a bit more to do, isn't it? I'll just refine these last few points. Looks good. And copy and paste this keyframe where I have the hold. Alright, let's check out how that bridged the gap for us. Yeah, these points are a bit closer to where they're going to end up. And of course, now I need to finish adding keyframes to the mask for the entire duration of the animation. This is going to take a while, and I'm not going to make you sit through it. And honestly, I already did it. I'm just recording this now for demonstration purposes. So I'm not even going to do the whole thing. Let's just speed through it. And done. Fantastic. You can see I only went to about the 6-second mark. Now we're ready for the exciting part. Let's open the Content Aware Fill panel. If you don't see it, you can go to the Window menu and click to open it. Let's check the settings. The fill method is surface. Good. Lighting correction, strong. The range can be either the work area or the entire duration. I'm going to keep work area selected because I only went to about 6 seconds. So I'm going to expand the view of my timeline here and drag that work area back to about 6 seconds. Then I can focus back in and refine it right to there. 6 seconds, 2 frames. Now when we generate our fill layer, the Content Aware Fill panel knows only to use our work area. Now, you'll notice 2 buttons at the bottom of the Content Aware Fill panel. The first one is Create Reference Frame. Guess what this does? It opens Photoshop, so you can create a reference frame of exactly how you want it to look. Interesting. For my first reference frame, I'm going to go back to the very first frame. Let's create a reference frame for this image. I will click the reference frame button. It's going to create that reference frame, and then it's going to open Photoshop. Now, we've already done the Photoshop tutorial. You know all this already. That's why I'm just going to speed through it. So once we're finished covering the seams with Generative Fill, all we have to do is save the PSD file and return to After Effects. We should also create additional reference frames wherever there's a big change or a change in lighting. You want to have lots of reference frames around big changes. So I'm going to add a few more here to help the Generative Fill understand what I want it to do. If things are fairly static, I'd recommend a reference frame at least every 2 seconds. So now you can see my 4 reference frames on my timeline. Now we have one last step before we generate the fill layer. We're going to come over here and change our mask setting to subtract. You will see everything that we have masked has now disappeared, and that is what it is going to fill. Let's make sure our mask is selected. You will see the fill target is now highlighted. Let's generate our fill layer. It's going to now analyze the clip and generate the fill. If the process is successful for you, great. If it messes something up, guess what? You can create additional reference frames and try again. If there's one area where it's having a lot of trouble, create more reference frames and try again. Or if it just messes up one frame, create a reference frame and the reference frame will cover it up. Once After Effects has finished analyzing, it's going to render the new frames. Alright, here's the moment of truth. Let's see how it did. Okay, the playback is showing this little line along the edge, which makes me really nervous. Let's change the mask setting back to none and see if it's still there. Nope, it's gone. What do you think? I think that looks pretty good. Another reason why this speeds up the process so much is generating the fill layer for every frame all at once. You don't have to do it one by one by one. So now, of course, we've only done one seam. We still have this seam on the side. Before you do a second seam or mask, I highly recommend pre-composing all these layers. This way you can keep your seam removal process organized and focused. Now I can quickly add the mask here and repeat the process as we did with the previous seam. Once finished, pre-compose all your layers and you can use the new composition to finish your post-processing in After Effects. To get my final version, I pre-composed my seam removal layers, keyed the green screen background, changed the sequence settings to a 4K 16:9, positioned the crop, composited the background, and added a handheld camera effect. If you're finished, you can export to your preferred format. Alright, I think we're all set. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below.